Göring laughed at Ford building planes. That is the hook and the dare. Picture a man who believed war machines must be born in craft shops, bent by master hands, guarded by guild pride. Now picture a mile of concrete, a river of parts, and a moving line that never sleeps. The first image is glamour, the second is victory. This story is the turn from one to the other. It begins with a sneer and ends with a number, 10-1. The gap so large it looks like fiction until you walk the floor, smell the oil, and time the takt. Set the stage. America in the late 1930 seconds is an auto nation with habits carved by cars. Standard parts, fast lines, job sheets anyone can follow by the second. Germany is an air nation with pride in precision. Fitters, files, hand-adjusted skins married to engines tuned like violins. The two worlds look like different planets. One is speed, the other is touch. Air leaders on the continent look west at a car builder and say, in effect, nice for sedans, useless for wings. That was the laugh. The bet was that mass production does not belong in the sky. The year turns, the orders swell, the gamble fails. Begin at the front door of an American plant at dawn. Workers pour in waves. The floor boss drills a truth into new ears. The hard part is not building one bomber. The hard part is building the 1,000th in fewer hours than the 100th, and the 10,000th in fewer hours than the 1,000th. This is the learning curve as a way of life. It is not magic. It is layout, jigs, gauges, and the right to stop the line when the hole is off by a hair. It is the choice to trade artisanal pride for statistical control. It is the courage to say that a tool that locates a rivet with repeatable accuracy is more heroic than a craftsman's eye that does it about right each time. Now turn the camera to the materials desk. War is not only wings, it is aluminum allotments, copper priority letters, rubber quotas, and tool steel shipped too. The constraint, not the loudest voice. The structure that makes the 10-1 gap real is not one plant. It is a web. It is the board that allocates. It is the office that issues a priority rating and moves a train car overnight. It is the finance arm that pays for a building before the rebar cools. People love to say, Ford built bombers. The truth is cleaner and more useful. A car company put its system on a plane, but the country put its shoulder behind the system. That is how the laugh dies. Walk the first miles of this story. At the start, the line stutters. Fixtures drift. Inspections bounce planes back to rework pens. The rate falls short. Critics smirk. Then the boring work begins. Pins get hardened. Rails get trued. Work content gets rebalanced station by station. A tail cone that took too long to fit gets a jig that locks it in 3 moves. A wiring harness that knotted under stress gets a template and a pull test. A gauge that gave false pass marks is recut. A drill, pattern that wandered, is pinned. The line breathes again. Hours per unit fall. Scrap falls. Confidence rises. Do not mistake the tone here. This is not a hymn to one brand. It is a record of motion that turned chaos into cadence. 1 month, 100 planes, then 150, then 200, and the quality still holds. The noise in the system drops. The crews smile when the rate climbs because they own it. A new hire learns to torque a nut by feel and by spec. A machinist shows a teenager how to read a drawing and spot a burr in a clip that will rattle at altitude. Managers learn to live by line of balance charts and stop guessing. Welders rehearse until a bead looks the same across shifts. Quality is no longer an accident. It is baked in. Meanwhile, the sky darkens over the other side of the ocean. Airfields burn. Rail nodes shatter. Fuel stocks thin. A perfect plane without fuel is a monument. A brilliant design in a scattered shop network is a headache. This is the second half of the lesson. Output is not just what leaves the factory. Output is the flow that survives the journey from ore to wing to mission. When the supply routes break, handmade glory stalls. When the workforce scatters under pressure and the engines wait for bearings that never come, the math turns against pride. The nation that laughed at mass flow must improvise under fire. Restart, relocate, disperse. It all helps, and yet each move adds friction. Return to the floor with the cameras low and the voice calm. The viewer sees a straight line. That is not an accident of architecture. Straight lines cut decision time. They reveal where the rate dies. They let supervisors see bottlenecks from a catwalk and fix them. Straight lines also teach. A veteran can stand in one spot and say, "We're off today," just by sound. That sense grows when the work is the same, and the work content is balanced. The plain look of a moving line hides a profound idea. If the process stays the same, the plain look of a moving line hides a profound idea. Hands can vary, and the quality will not. With training, a new team can hit spec. With repetition, a young line can climb in rate. The shape of the line creates the shape of the war. Now build the thesis with care. The 10-to-1 headline is not a magic year-wide average carved in stone. It is a dramatic way to express what happened in crucial windows and categories when the system found its stride and the other side ran into hard walls. The point is not to pick a single month and plant a flag. The point is to show the mechanism that made such windows possible at all. That mechanism is boring by design. Paper forms, priorities, fixtures, gauges, training cards, pay rules that reward rate with quality, not rate alone, audit trails that keep vendors honest, schedules that favor the constraint and starve everything else. This is the quiet music that drowns a loud laugh. By the end of this opening, you should feel the weight of the pivot. The story is not about a single genius. It is about a nation that realized mass methods could climb into the sky if you respected measurement more than myth. It is about what happens when you make the process the hero. The first frames may have been an insult. The last frames are a scoreboard. Engines turn, tires roll, wings stack in rows under bright lights. Each one is not perfect in a gallery sense. Each one is the same in the right ways. That sameness is what sends waves of aircraft across oceans. That sameness is why the math goes lopsided. That sameness is the sober answer to the laugh, steady, cumulative, and final. End with the promise that drives the next pages. We will put receipts on the table. We will trace the line from speech to shovel to jig to sortie. We will show how the first months failed and why the later months flew. We will walk through the people who learned this system and the boards that kept steel and rubber on path. We will name the constraints that choked the other side and the choices that made it worse. And we will make the lesson clear for today. If you want scale under pressure, you must make the process visible, the priorities strict, and the measurement cold. That is how a laugh becomes a lesson, and a lesson becomes a number that cannot be ignored. This story is not a museum piece. It is a mirror for a present full of pressure. Nations talk about deterrence, surge, and resilience. Companies argue about reshoring and stockpiles. Voters want safety without waste. Leaders want speed without fraud. Engineers want standards without strangling innovation. The scenes you are about to see are old in calendar years and current in every other sense. They show what it takes to turn talk into flow and fear into throughput. They show how to move a complex industry from boutique output to volume that changes a war. They show how to build strength that lasts longer than a headline. Look at the world today. Supply chains run long. Extreme weather throws random wrenches. Materials tighten. Skilled labor is scarce in key trades. The temptation is to romanticize craft and despair at scale. But the lesson from the past is clear. You can scale quality if you put the process first and if you build the right guardrails around money and materials. This was done before under worse stress than most peacetime years will ever see. It took blunt tools and patient discipline. It took people who learned on the job and leaders who would not blink when the line begged for shortcuts. It took a framework that let firms earn a profit without gaming the schedule. It took trust, and that trust was earned by inspection and audit, not slogans. There is another reason this story matters. We live in an age of speed myths. We believe that the fastest wins, and we confuse fast starts with fast systems. The early months at the big plant in the story were not fast, they were messy. Output missed targets, rework 8 cycles, critics called it a flop. The miracle was not a quick win. The miracle was the refusal to declare defeat and chase a new toy. The teams fixed jigs. They rebalanced stations. They wrote better work instructions. They trained supervisors to teach. They built a culture where stopping the line for a quality issue was not a sin, but a duty. In a time that craves viral peaks, the quiet curve of learning is the real hero. It rises slowly, then all at once. Think about the idea of industrial policy, a phrase that can start an argument in any room. In our story, policy is not a grand theory. It is a set of simple rules enforced with focus. Prioritize scarce alloys for the narrowest choke point. Pay faster when milestones are real. Refuse to spread machine tools like butter. Force standardization where parts must interchange. Allow variation where innovation still finds gains. Keep the chart of constraints on the wall and update it weekly. The agencies in the background did not build planes. They shaped the riverbed so the current flowed. That is what policy looks like when it works. It is not glamorous. It is not ideology. It is the plumbing that lets a system reach scale without collapsing under its own noise. This story also matters because of labor. In our own time, people worry that the next surge will find us short of hands, short of skills, and short of patience. The record you are about to read shows how a workforce can be built fast without throwing quality away. The key was not magic talent hidden in a corner. It was training that broke tasks into steps, supervisors who knew how to coach, and tools that made the right way the easy way. Women took jobs that once were closed to them. Migrants moved from farms to lines. Teens learned fast and grew into masters. The pride came not from mystique but from mastery shared across thousands of hands. It can be done again if we respect training as production, not as a sideshow. There is a wider truth here that pushes beyond war machines. It lives in energy build-outs, in medical kit production, in heavy transport, in chips, and in fiber. When a nation needs more of a complex thing in a hurry, practice beats posture. You must make bottlenecks visible. You must measure learning in hours per unit and defect rates, not only in glossy totals. You must be willing to publish the bad month so the good month can be believed. The team in our story did that under cameras and pressure and enemies who hoped they would fail. They did it because they made the work boring enough to scale and human enough to care. Remember the laugh that opened this story. It was not only directed at a firm, it was aimed at a concept, that everyday methods used to build cars could touch the sacred world of flight. We live in a moment when new sacred cows appear each year. Some leaders say certain technologies cannot be standardized. Some say their craft is beyond boring measurements. Some say their field cannot use fixtures, gauges, or line balance because it is too special. That is usually a story we tell to protect status. The past is a witness against that story. With care and patience, special can become scalable without losing safety. The moment that happens, costs fall, rates rise, and the world changes. Finally, this story matters because of truth. Numbers are not slogans, they are anchors. When we talk about 10 to 1, we are not chanting. We are pointing to a real, lopsided fact, explained by mechanics and management, by fuel and rails, by lines that ran and lines that stopped. We will treat numbers here as plot points you can verify, not as decorations. We will give months and sequences and causes. We will show how each shift on the line came from a change in tooling, training, or policy, and how each drop on the other side came from a broken link in a chain that could not be fixed in time. This is the only way to honor the workers who lived those curves. It is also the only way to draw lessons that can guide us now. So take this as a live guide, not a museum tour. If you are in a role that needs to build more of a complex thing, this narrative is for you. If you care about national strength, it is for you. If you run a small shop that wants to become a big one without losing its soul, it is for you. The people you will meet in these pages were not saints and not magicians. They were builders. They built standards and lines and habits. They built trust and rate. They built enough to change the sky, and they did it under the eyes of men who once laughed. That is why this story matters. That is why we begin. At first glance, the idea is absurd. Cars roll, planes fly. Car bodies can be off by a mill and no one dies. Airframes cannot. Cars love repetition. Planes hate variance but demand precision. The tooling looks different. The tolerances feel different. The tests sound different. Early visitors to the big line looked at the shiny fixtures and shook their heads. They saw speed and thought sloppy. They saw rows of workers and thought untrained. They saw a moving line and thought reckless. The first months gave fuel to the doubters. Output targets missed. Rework piles grew. Whole sections came back for refit. It looked like proof that craft was the only safe path to the sky. But that was the surface view. Beneath it, a quiet translation was underway. The auto method did not copy itself onto aircraft. It learned, adapted, and changed shape. The heart of that change was fixturing. In a car plant, a body drop can tolerate small drifts. In a bomber plant, a bulkhead must meet a skin within hair-thin ranges across many feet. The answer was not a lecture about craftsman pride. The answer was a better jig. Hardened pins. Locating blocks that touched only where geometry demanded. Reference datums that matched the drawing, not the habit of a shift. Once the jigs locked geometry, skill moved to setup and maintenance, not to the wrist of the final fitter. Quality rose because the process carried it. Then came gauges. A go divided by no-go gauge is a humble thing. It is also a revolution. It moves decision-making from, I think this fits, to this either fits or it does not. Millions of parts flowed in from a web of vendors. Without gauges, the line becomes a debate at every station. With gauges, it becomes a rhythm. The upstream shops learned the same language. If the pin does not pass, rework happens upstream, not on the main line. This is how a moving line can exist for aircraft at all. It is not a gamble. It is a promise kept by metal, by pins, and by the courage to throw out parts that almost meet spec. Station balance followed. In autos, a balance chart spreads work content, so each station consumes about the same time. In the early bomber months, some stations were a storm and others a calm. Crews waited downstream while upstream teams wrestled a misaligned assembly or fished for fasteners that had no home. The fix was to map the work content like a score. Some tasks moved forward. Some moved back. A tool cart got standardized, so it arrived with what hands needed. A crane path changed, so a heavy lift did not hold the world hostage. People underestimate the power of one resequenced job. On a moving line, one step moved from minute 10 to minute 3 can raise the rate for the whole day. Another bridge had to be built between the worlds. Test and inspection. Car tests are durable but simple. A roll, a shower, a list of sounds to hunt. Plane tests are complex. Pressure tests, electrical continuity, flight surfaces, engines under load, structural checks. Early on, much of that load piled up at the end. The final stations felt like hospitals for patients who should have been vaccinated upstream. The teams redesigned inspection to spread it. A leak check moved to a sub-assembly station. A wiring proof moved to a harness cell. A surface profile check moved into the jig itself so out-of-spec parts could not pass. The line stopped less. The end-of-line rework pens emptied. The aircraft that reached the last bay were not miracles. They were the predictable result of upstream control. Training was the glue. You cannot run a moving line on a few heroes. You need thousands of people who do it the right way, the same way, every day. That takes a method for teaching work, not just telling it. It takes standardized worksheets that show the steps, the key points, and the reasons behind them. It takes supervisors who know how to break a job into teachable chunks and who respect the novice enough to let them try and err. It takes the right to stop the line without fear. At first, that right is used often and clumsily. Over time, it is used less because the need falls, not because people are scared. When a stop happens, blame stays on the process, not the person. Fix the jig, fix the gauge, fix the sequence, fix the tool, then try again. Skeptics said airframes are too variable for this discipline. They said each plane is a special snowflake, with quirks that only a master can cure. That belief dies when parts actually interchange. When a wing made on Tuesday mates with a fuselage made on Friday, and the holes line up because the locating scheme is true, the myth fades. When a team rotates across shifts and quality does not fall, the myth fades. When a young crew produces a section within hours per unit targets because the standard shows them where to hold and where to let springback occur, the myth fades. What remains is not a disrespect for skill. It is a respect for the kind of skill that designs a process so others can shine. Yes, there were limits. Not every aircraft component can flow like a fender. Some assemblies are stubborn. They demand artisan care because physics says so. But the miracle is how few those islands become once the rest of the sea is charted. The key is to isolate the true craft work, give it space and the right people, and refuse to let that island become an excuse for chaos everywhere else. In the end, the line is a mix. Fast standard stations where repeatability rules, and sealed bays where masters handle the delicate steps. The rate reflects how well leaders keep the border between those worlds clear and honest. By the time the system clicks, the floor feels different. Noise drops. Shouts turn to hand signals. Material arrives when needed and waits in kits, not in heaps. The smell of panic fades. Visitors who once smirked now look for ways to copy. They ask about the pin geometry and the preventive maintenance on jigs. They ask about the policy that moves scarce bearings to the true constraint, not to the plant with the best lobbyist. They ask about the schedule that measures both rate and defects with equal weight. They ask what happens when a vendor slips and how fast a new shop can be tooled and taught. They ask because the proof is no longer a promise. It is in the rows of finished aircraft and the hours per unit logged on clipboards. So yes, cars do not fly, but the discipline that makes cars cheap and reliable can teach planes to arrive in numbers that change a war. The trick is humility. Admit that the factory must change to meet tighter tolerances. Admit that tests must move upstream. Admit that the line can stop when truth demands it. Admit that the heroes you need are not only the wizards with files, but also the quiet minds who square a jig to the world. When that humility arrives, pride of a different sort returns. Not the pride of, only I can do this, but the pride of, we built this together, the same, right, and fast. That is the pride that sends aircraft east in waves and turns mockery into silence. The first honest anchor is place. The huge field in Michigan did not fall from the sky. It was drawn, poured, and roofed in a rush, a shape so large that the building itself became a landmark. Runways stretched like rulers, rail spurs curved in like veins. The design capacity set on paper looked bold, almost reckless. It asked for hundreds of large aircraft per month when the nation had barely learned to build tens. That number was not a boast. It was a demand on layout, on suppliers, and on every training hall within driving distance. The walls went up. The machines moved in. The first skeletons rolled past curious faces. The real work began. The second anchor is time. Early output was thin. The line crawled and stumbled. Every day taught a new lesson about jigs that slipped, holes that wandered, and harnesses that kinked. The world outside did not wait. Orders piled. The front needed weight in the air. The teams found their footing. Month by month, the rate rose. Midway through the life of the plant, a plateau fell. Then another. Late in the arc, peak months arrived that made the early days look like a rehearsal. Bodies came together on the hour. Trucks carried subassemblies in tidy kits. Inspectors found fewer heartstoppers. The pens for rework shrank. The charts on office walls showed smooth climbs where once there were jagged spikes. In certain stretches, the flow looked unreal, the kind of flow that turns a front and makes a legend. The third anchor is people. The workforce did not match any old stereotype of aviation. It was broader, younger, more diverse, and often brand new to such work. They learned on the floor, through short courses after shifts, and by watching veterans who taught with patience. They learned to trust gauges more than guesses. They learned to respect the published standard, and also the one quiet trick that kept a step safe. They learned to lift as a team, to signal without shouting, to pace to the line, and to see waste. They learned pride without mystique. On payday Fridays, the parking lot was loud. On rate days, the floor was calm. That calm was not boredom. It was competence. The fourth anchor is the web that fed the line. Engines did not grow in the back lot. Instruments came from small shops with bright lamps and sore eyes. Aluminum arrived as ingot and left as skin. Tires came on pallets. Glass came in frames. Every item had a card, a priority, a path. When a vendor stumbled, the plant did not die. The network flexed. A second shop took a share. A rail schedule shifted. A set of machine tools was pried loose from a less critical project and sent with a letter that brooked no delay. People miles away felt the tug of the big line's schedule and learned to live by it. This is what a national system looks like in motion. It is not smooth, but it is relentless. Now face the number in the title with clear eyes. 10-1. Treat it as a way to capture something that the camera can only hint at. There were periods and categories in which the American system's flow dwarfed the opponent's. In some months, the gap was shocking. In heavy craft and in training pipeline outputs, in spare parts and in repair kits, the ratio turned lopsided enough to change the sky. Exact counts varied by month and by type. What never varied was the direction once the process matured. Each week of steady rate compounded into a force the other side could not match, while trains burned and fuel stocks thinned. The laugh at the beginning did not survive this math. Consider the way hours per aircraft fell as the plant learned. Early builds took a small army and a long shift. Teams ran long, then longer, to make up errors born upstream. After fixture redesigns and sequence fixes, hours dropped. The curve bent down. It is a living thing you can feel in the muscles of a crew. Tasks become second nature. The right tool hangs where the hand expects it. The kit cart always has the right bag at the top. The drill bit that skates is replaced with one that bites. The sealant that's smeared gets a better gun. Errors do not vanish. They shrink and appear sooner. This is the kind of learning that managers can plot and workers can feel. It is how a building that did not exist one year can send out aircraft in rows the next. Across the ocean, the constraint stack thickened. Official orders pushed for more even as bombs fell and rail traffic grew chaotic. Plants dispersed to reduce risk, but dispersion brought new pains. Coordination lagged. Sub-assemblies arrived misaligned. Jigs were not the same across sites. Skilled workers were scarce, and new ones could not be absorbed fast enough. Fuel shortages hit training and cut sortie hours, reducing the experience curve for pilots and ground crews. Engine output became a hard limit, and a program that chased dazzling late-war designs stole attention from the dull, necessary work of stable rate. In pictures, the lines look brave. In ledgers, the numbers tell the real story. Keep the focus on receipts the audience can hold, a map with a dot and a long building, a date when the first airframe rolled, and a later date when the rate broke through. A photograph of women teaching women how to talk, and a neat stack of bins with rivets sorted by length and head. A memo allocating alloys by priority to the few machines that held the schedule together. A shift calendar with training blocks inked in because training is production. A graph that shows hours per aircraft bending downward, and another that shows monthly outputs climbing like a staircase. This is not decoration. It is how a mind anchors belief. Finally, tell the human truth behind the facts. The workers in the pictures did not stand inside a headline. They stood at a station with work content measured in minutes. They tightened, checked, and signed. They trained others. They stopped the line when things were wrong. They took pride in sending an airframe down the rails, knowing the next crew would not curse their name. They did it through winters and graveyard shifts, and days when the news from the front hit too close. They did it because the system around them made it possible to do it well, and when the planes stacked in rows under the sun and taxied off, they could see with their own eyes what the laugh had missed. Discipline is not dull when it saves lives, and sameness is not boring when it wins wars. These are the facts you can hold. Place, time, people, web, curve, constraint, they form the spine of the tale. They do not need flourishes to impress. They need only to be shown with clarity and care. Do that, and the old sneer loses all power. Do that, and the gap in outputs turns from myth to memory you can trust. Do that, and the lesson becomes useful for any age that must turn design into flow under pressure. The laugh fades, the engines start, the line moves, the math holds. The years before the flood of machines were not empty. They were a slow tightening of bolts the world could not yet see. In the late 30s, the idea of turning automobile discipline toward the sky was a hunch, expressed in meetings that felt more like wagers than plans. A radio speech promised an arsenal, and men and women across the country listened in kitchens and union halls and asked the same question: how would talk turn into rate? The first moves were legal moves, invisible to most. Lines of authority were redrawn so that one office could tell a mill to pour ingot for wings instead of pots, and another could place a priority tag on a crate so it jumped every queue between a foundry and a railhead. Budgets were unlocked with signatures that looked like dates on paper and like weeks saved on the floor. Nothing in those early months looked like glory, but the plumbing of a system began to take shape. The next scene is the soundscape of concrete. Trucks groaned in rhythms that set the pace for everything to come. Foundations ate money and rebar in measures that frightened accountants and thrilled foremen. Rail spurs curved inward, because a factory without arteries is a promise without breath. At first glance, the shape looked absurdly large, but that is what flow demands. Flow needs room for mistakes, and the first months would be mostly mistakes learned in public. Inside those walls, teams rehearsed, new choreography with plywood mock-ups, tracing the moves a fuselage would make through space, learning where a crane would clash with a beam, and where a kit cart must wait or risk killing the hour. War erased the last doubts. Orders arrived in phrases that did not blink. The cadence of requests made ambition feel like duty. Training halls went loud. Recruiters found hands in towns that never expected to make wings. The first partial assemblies moved on carts that bumped and rattled because the floor was still raw. Still, motion began. Skeletons of aircraft received their first skins. Inspectors did their first harsh pass and rejected whole sections without apology. A visitor today would call those rejections waste. The people on the floor called them tuition. A nation was paying to learn at speed. In the year when fear crested overseas, the mood inside shifted from doubt to calm intensity. The early line stops had been chaotic, the kind that scatter blame and sour tempers. By mid-course they became surgical. A stop had a reason, a fix, and an owner, and the restart felt like a pledge. Managers learned to trust the boards that showed constraint more than the loudest voice in a meeting. The first time a month closed with a number that shocked the skeptics, the applause was quiet and private. Loud celebration belongs to victory laps. Manufacturing belongs to second shifts that punch out tired and content. The outside world pushed back with weather and with shortages and with news from the front that tightened throats. A season of snow tested logistics. Coal cars stuck in drifts, and workers walked under flurries to shifts that demanded dexterity from cold fingers. Even then the line moved, because the schedule had been built around the idea that bad months are not an edge case but a certainty. Kits were packed with buffers that did not feel luxurious when the storm hit. Sub-assemblies were pulled forward and banked where space allowed. The discipline looked fussy in bright weather. It looked like wisdom when winter stung. The year that the plant truly woke up, the air outside smelled like spring and oil. The first week of that season produced more completed wings than any full month in the earliest period. Cameras finally found frames that felt like the promise had been kept. You could stand on a catwalk and see the future in a straight line. The plant moved with a kind of grace that only exists after 1,000 bruises. New hires stepped into a pace that would have broken veterans the year before, yet they did not break because the tools, the jigs, and the work instructions had been tuned for ordinary hands and extraordinary expectations. While the home front found rhythm, the other side of the ocean fell into a kind of exhausted improvisation. Bombs did not end output by themselves, but they broke the rhythm that complex systems require. A dispersed network of shops kept the flame alive, yet dispersion added latency and confusion. Rail, lines that once fed factories with metronomic predictability, began to fail in clusters. Fuel moved from scarcity to crisis. Training hours for pilots fell because gasoline is not a suggestion. The line of battle turned consumption into a cruel teacher. Maintainers robbed parts from grounded airframes to keep a few flying, and that scavenging ended up taxing factories as much as demand did. By the last seasons of the central period, the plant's timeline reads like a staircase without missing steps. Rows of aircraft in photographs are not abstractions. They are the embodiment of a schedule that was finally believed. Internally, the language evolved. People stopped talking about heroics and started talking about cadence. A good day was not a rescue. It was a quiet adherence to a flow everyone could feel. The final quarters brought peak months that would stand for decades as symbols of what a nation can do when it decides that dull excellence is more valuable than glittering intent. The calendar did not lie, and the line did not apologize. The work had turned the years into a straight story. The work of building machines at speed begins before the first bolt and above the shop floor. The most important actors in this story do not hold wrenches. They sign papers that decide which wrench exists, where, and when. In a nation that loves to think of industry as 1,000 independent heroes, there had to be an office that could say yes and no, with the power to make the answer stick. That office, and others that grew around it, formed the machinery of decision that turned promise into rate. When people talk about the system, they often mean this machine, a blend of statute, schedule, and stubborn clarity about what matters. At the center sat a board with the right to set priorities and to allocate scarce materials under a legal authority that survived courtroom challenges and bruising meetings with governors, mayors, and executives who all believed their project was the one that mattered most. A letter from this board carried a rating that climbed to the front of the line at mills and machine shops. A plant that tried to leapfrog that sequence learned quickly that auditors carried their own kind of force. Banking arms linked to the state-financed roofs and rail spurs and cranes before private appetite would have dared. And they did it not as charity but as a structured bet on rate. The military customers did not watch from a distance. They brought inspectors and acceptance officers into the plant and seeded them across the vendor base. They brought test regimens that could have choked the line if left untouched. Instead of insisting on final exams at the end, they worked with builders to distribute tests through the flow. That decision, simple on paper, saved months and millions of steps of rework. Uniformed buyers had authority, but the best of them learned to listen to the grizzled foreman who knew which jig drifted when humidity rose and which tool room could grind a gauge overnight without lying about it. This machinery needs fuel that has no smell or color. Information. Schedules are not wish lists, they are maps of constraints. The agencies took schedules as seriously as the line took rivets. Every week a meeting convened that looked like a doctor's round. The constraint was the patient, and nurses and surgeons spoke in crisp, unpoetic terms. If a machine tool at a vendor was the true choke, then the schedule for that tool, not the rhetoric of any executive, became the calendar that mattered. The board could reach into the country and move a lathe from one shop to another with a single letter, and trains made that letter true. Money matters in this machine, but money alone does nothing without rules. The rules looked dull and saved the day. Builders were paid for progress in ways that rewarded stable rate and repeatable quality. Costs were audited and profits capped, not as punishment, but to keep the focus on the scoreboard that mattered. A plant could earn well by being reliable, not by inventing change orders. The flip side of that discipline was speed from the state in paying for legitimate progress. Cash flow built trust. Trust bought honesty at review tables. Honesty let people admit where the real trouble lived, and trouble confessed is trouble half solved. The machinery also had a cultural job, to teach leaders to love boredom. The showy fix tempts managers, but the true work is in systems, forms, and the courage to say no to distractions. When a new design glittered and threatened to steal minds from stable production, the offices reminded everyone of the mission and the months. They made room for carefully managed change where the payoff was real and near. They denied the rest. Decisions were not random. They were bound to an agreed plan that named what would be built, in what order, at what rate, and with what substitutions allowed when supply bit hard. No machine runs forever, without maintenance, and the apparatus of decision was no exception. Investigations were launched when rumors of waste surfaced. Some rumors proved true, and men lost contracts and reputations. Reform followed, not as theatre, but as tweaks to the rules that cut a loophole closed. The public demanded accountability, and the offices learned to publish enough truth to earn that trust without feeding enemies. Measured transparency is itself a form of armor. It kept the machine legitimate in the eyes of the people whose taxes and sons fed it. At the edge of this system lived the vendors who fed the line. Small shops made delicate parts that large plants could not make without wasting time and skill. The machinery of decision reached into these shops too, not with a heavy boot, but with a promise. Do your part reliably, and we will move heaven and rail to keep you fed with material, tools, and orders you can count on. The promise was kept often enough that the network steadied. When a vendor failed, substitution was real. Drawings were shared. Master gauges travelled with couriers. A second shop stood up a cell in days rather than months because the rules had been written with that emergency in mind. From a distance, this sounds like bureaucracy. Up close, it felt like breath. The office that signed a priority letter gave a plant the right to believe in tomorrow's kit. The uniform who moved a test upstream saved a week for 1,000 people. The banker who funded a roof in winter made spring output possible. The auditor who pulled a bad invoice up by its roots kept the game honest and the schedule believable. The leaders who said no to shiny distractions bought months of uninterrupted cadence. None of this carried romance, but all of it carried the number on the wall. Decisions made this way look boring until the day you count aircraft on a ramp. Learning at scale is not a slogan. It is a body memory built from bruises and then protected by rules. On the first day, the line moved. It lurched like a new foal. Work content piled up in the oddest places. A team would rush for a lift only to wait for a crane that had wandered to help a neighbour. A harness would snake through a frame only to bind at a point no one had marked. A drill bit would skid and chew an oval scar that engineers later traced to a misread reference plane. The instinct on such days is to work harder. The discipline learned over months is to work clearer. The change from muscle to method is the turning point between a proud attempt and a reliable rate. The first mechanism is geometry that does not drift. Fixturing became religion. A jig that located 3 datums to truth took precedence over any tool that promised speed without certainty. Maintenance crews learned to treat jigs like patients. They measured, recorded, and replaced pins by calendar, not complaint. When a station went out of tune, the logs could show whether the fault lived in metal or method. The effect on morale was quiet and profound. Crews knew that if they cared for the tools would care for the work. The air changed from blame to stewardship, and with it the numbers began to behave. The second mechanism was language. Drawings, work instructions, and gauges had to speak the same dialect. Early on, 3 teams could argue for an hour about what a line on a plan really meant. Standardizing the symbols and anchoring them to a set of master gauges ended that waste. A go divided by no-go plug here and an edge finder there turned arguments into checks. Vendors were issued copies of the same truth, and traveling inspectors carried that truth from town to town. Interchangeability stopped being a hope and became a habit, the kind of habit that lets a wing meet a fuselage on a Friday without a prayer. The third mechanism was balance, not the slogan about work-life balance that fills posters, but the hard math of matching minutes. Engineers walked the line with clipboards and stopwatches and found the places where time pooled and starved. They did not throw bodies at the problem. They moved tasks, changed hand positions, relocated carts, and designed small jigs that eliminated a contortion. Over weeks, the set of jobs at each station became a chord that could be played by ordinary hands at an ordinary tempo. When a new variant arrived, the same calm process rebalanced the chord rather than shattering the song. Quality traveled upstream. Early on, defects hid until the end, where they multiplied like bad rumors. The line adopted a rule that felt expensive for a week and cheap forever after. Do not pass defects forward. Tests moved into the flow. A leak that used to reveal itself under a final pressure canopy now exposed itself in a subassembly cell where the fix cost minutes, not days. Electrical continuity checks left the dusk-lit end bay and appeared wherever a harness first met a frame. Supervisors learned to hunt causes rather than culprits, and technicians learned to treat every failure as a gift that had arrived in time. The fifth mechanism was the right to stop without stigma. At the start, a line stop felt like a failure. After the culture matured, a stop felt like a surgeon calling for silence. The reason was documented. The cause was found, fixed, and prevented from returning by a change to a sheet, a tool, or a training module. Leaders taught by example. When a veteran halted flow for a crooked frame and the manager backed them in front of visitors, a lesson burned into everyone. If the stop proved trivial, no one wore a scar. The right existed to keep the rate honest. Hours per aircraft told the truth that talk often hides. The first 100 builds were a storm. The second 100 cut the pain in half. The third 100 became boring in the most beautiful way. Boredom meant that variation had been killed where it could be killed, and fenced where it had to be fenced. New variants of the product did arrive, as they always do in war, and each variant threatened the curve. The lesson was to stage changes. Do not let novelty spray across stations like shrapnel. Absorb it at a few bays, prove it there, then let it flow only when the curve says ready. Vendors learned the same lessons under a smaller roof. Early shipments wobbled. Gauges did not match from shop to shop. Drawings were interpreted as suggestions. The network adopted master gauges and traveling inspectors who carried doctrine in their briefcases. A bearing from one town fit a housing from another, because both obeyed the same steel truths checked by the same go, divided by no-go profile. When a shop cried that tolerances were too tight, an engineer did not argue. They unpacked the gauge set and showed where slop was hiding. Pride survived. Guesswork did not. Learning also meant teaching leaders to see. Walks along the line became a ritual that resembled the rounds of a clinic. Managers asked 3 questions in a loop. What is the rate right now? Where is the constraint right now? What is the one thing that will move the constraint tomorrow without hurting it today? Answers lived on walls and on the tongues of crews who owned their stations. When a leader barked for more bodies at a non-constraint, the ritual corrected them. Put people at the choke, feed it with kits, guard it with maintenance. Everything else waits its turn. The final mechanism was memory. Every improvement that saved a minute or prevented a defect had to be captured, taught, and guarded. The temptation after a win is to move on. The discipline is to write the win into the standard so it cannot evaporate when a veteran retires or a team rotates. The joke on the floor said that gravity pulled good ideas back into chaos unless you bolted them down with ink. Ink, in this case, was a training card, a changed fixture, a new gauge, or a photo on a standard showing where the hand should rest. That is how a line learns and stays learned. The faces in the photographs are the true argument. A. nation asked strangers to learn work that once belonged to tight guilds, and the strangers said yes. They came in from bus stops and farm roads, with lunch pails and uneasy pride. The first hours on the floor felt like walking into a foreign language. The sounds were sharp, the rules were strict, the pace was set by a clock on a wall. Very quickly the language became theirs. Training did not live in a back room. It lived on the line, at benches, in shadow sessions where one set of hands mirrored another, until muscle memory replaced fear. The promise was simple and radical. You will learn, and we will make learning possible. In the training halls, instructors broke jobs down into steps with reasons. A talk was not just a number. It was a ritual that prevented mental fatigue under stress at altitude. A seal was not just a smear of compound. It was the difference between a comfortable crew and a system failure at cold heights. The best teachers refused to let learners mimic. They made them speak each reason aloud while they practiced. Then they made them teach the same to the next new hire to prove understanding. Pride grew as a byproduct of precision rather than as a substitute for it, which is the safest pride of all. The workforce did not look like a guild. Women stood in rows with drills and rivet guns, laughing on breaks and, on the line, wearing a calm a camera cannot fake. Men who had never known a blueprint learned to read drawings and to trust rulers more than folklore. Migrants from the south brought patience and grit, moved into cold cities, and wrote letters home about the feel of aluminum under the hands. Veterans of small shops taught tricks that translated into saved minutes across 1,000 stations. The new mix did not dissolve into noise because the method provided a grammar everyone could share. Teams formed inside this larger mass. A bay crew developed its own shorthand. A sub-assembly cell stayed after to tune its jigs and left a chalk note for the next shift about a quirk they had fixed. People began to perform favors across departmental lines because they understood the whole, not only their corner. They knew the constraint by name. They knew when a vendor's late crate would threaten it. They knew a missing kit would matter more at 10 in the morning than at 3 in the afternoon. This system-wide awareness turned thousands of hands into something that felt like a single mind. The policy that governed pay and advancement supported this culture. Raises followed mastery and reliability. Promotions rewarded quiet leaders who taught and stabilized more than loud ones who boasted. The right to stop the line and the duty to stop it were taught on the first day and defended by supervisors who cared more about tomorrow's rate than today's optics. There were tensions, as there always are where speed and pride meet. Sometimes a crew wanted to push a borderline part forward. Sometimes a manager wanted a number too badly. The method and the memory of past pain pulled everyone back to discipline. The training pipeline had to solve a harder problem than skill. It had to defeat fatigue. Rotations were used with care so that bodies did not break under the same motion for months. Short, timed exercises kept speed honest without turning workers into sprinters who burned out. Instructors watched hands for strain and ears for stress. When a step caused too many sore wrists, a small tool appeared that shifted load to a stronger muscle group. When a checklist caused eye glaze, it was rewritten so the mind could see the job again. The line only runs when people can, and people only can when leaders care. The new faces did not only learn, they taught back. A farm kid pointed out that a cart's wheel bearings were starving because the grease was wrong for the season. A seamstress suggested a way to stage fabric insulation so the cut went faster and cleaner. A machinist from a shuttered shop redesigned a clamp so a fragile housing could be held without bruises. The line accumulated these small gifts. It gave them legal names in updated standards so they could not evaporate when a shift changed or a worker moved away. In this way, improvement became democratic and durable. Beyond the line, the community learned to live with the plant's gravity. Buses ran earlier. Cafes served at odd hours. Schools adjusted schedules to help families that lived by shifts. Childcare improvisations turned into stable services. Churches and unions found new ways to handle grievances that mixed faith, fatigue, and the urgency of a war no one could ignore. The city itself became part of the machine. It fed the plant with rested hands and took from it the confidence that comes from doing something difficult together and getting a little better at it every week. In every photograph, a detail repeats. The eyes. People look at the camera with a steadiness that says the work has entered their bones. That steadiness is the foundation under every ratio and headline. It came from training that honored them, tools that fit them, rules that protected them, and leaders who respected their time. When they walked out in the grey light after a night shift, they carried the quiet pride of those who know their effort will not be wasted by chaos at the top or vanity at the edge. The planes that rolled into the sun bore the marks of their hands, and those marks looked like confidence. Stand on the catwalk and look past the rushing line and the bright bays. Beyond the walls stretches the unseen city that makes each minute possible. Mines and mills, presses and heat-treat ovens, glass rooms, rubber vats, switchyards, harbours and depots. Ore becomes ingot, ingot becomes sheet, sheet becomes skin, and every hand in that chain learns to work to a language of gauges and dates. The line may be the star, but the supply web is the sky that lets the star shine. Without it, a factory is a stranded island with no tide, no weather, and no life. With it, the island becomes a port, and every hour becomes possible because someone else kept a promise you will never see kept. Metal is the first voice you hear. In distant valleys, blast furnaces exhale, ladles pour, and hot slabs wait for mills that roll them thin without tearing their grain. Coils move to presses that learn the set of a curve, to extruders that spit out spars, to machine shops that shave to lines, so fine a dial hardly moves. At each stage, a master gauge travels with the order like a passport. When the pin will not pass, the piece stays where it is. It sounds harsh. It saves months. Parts that lie to the gauge will lie to a wing, and a wing that lies will teach its lesson at altitude. The web learns this once, and then teaches it daily without argument. Engines form a separate constellation, both proud and fragile. Blocks are bored, journals ground, pistons weighed, valves lapped, and every surface marked by a tool that knows its own truth. An engine is a storm inside a case. Anything false becomes shrapnel. So the engine houses speak in numbers first, sentiment later. They ship in serialed lots with test cards clipped to crates. When a lot fails, the telegram moving back up the line is short, and the fix begins before the crate cools on a dock. Downstream, schedulers protect the bays that marry engines to airframes with the possessiveness of a lighthouse keeper. They feed those bays first, they guard them first, and when rationing hurts, they take the pain elsewhere. The delicate trades sing in brighter light. Instrument shops stamp legible faces and balance needles that must hold steady in vibration and cold. Glass houses temper panes that want to crack when the world above the clouds turns bitter. Each sheet is framed with seals that swell and shrink without surrendering. Fabric rooms cut insulation by patterns that seem humble until a loose thread becomes a draft in a black cabin. These places look nothing like a bomber, bay and everything like the nerve endings of a larger body. If you lose them, you lose sensation, and a machine without sensation becomes a danger to its crew and to everyone who trusts what the dial says. Rubber smells like distance. Tires arrive in batches, proofed and dated so shelf life cannot sneak into danger. Gaskets and hoses are matched to fluids like prescriptions. Grease is not generic. The wrong tub will kill a bearing in a week. Even the small luxuries, paints, dopes, sealants carry priority marks. Because nothing is small to a calendar that measures mission days in single digits. When shortages bite, substitutions exist, but substitutions travel with papers that name risks and countermeasures in plain words. No one pretends that a change is free. The web moves forward, eyes open. Railroads are veins and nerves at once. Yardmasters learn to treat a priority letter as an order of battle. They break trains in the night and hold back half a consist on a siding so one critical car can move. Schedulers, not celebrities, become the heroes you never see. A missed connection is not a shrug. It is a day erased from a frontline calendar. Sometimes the web needs air instead of steel, and a finished engine or a vital gauge set rides a courier flight. The price looks offensive until you set it against the price of waiting. The math turns cold and clear, and the airlift flies. Vendors do not arrive perfect, they are raised. A village shop that once made farm parts learns to hold tighter limits after inspectors arrive with master gauges in velvet-lined cases. The first time a heat treat cycle truly sticks, the report travels across desks like a small holiday. Another shop builds jigs to the master datums, so a rib drilled on Monday in one town will meet a skin drilled on Friday in another without prayer. These are not parables. They are daily acts of translation from pride to practice, from about right to right, the same way every time. The web grows stronger because each small room decides to join the dialect of precision. Information is the web's oxygen. Schedules ride by wire and paper, updated with a candor that hurts for a day and helps for a month. A controller's desk stacks cards that tell the life of every crate and kit. Born here, tested there, due at this dock by this dawn, greeted by that inspection. When a delay appears, contingency paths wake up. A road convoy picks up what a flooded spur cannot move. A second machine shop receives a drawing and a travelling set of gauges. Their night shift stands up a cell while the day shift sleeps. Signals flow back to the catwalk so the floor does not drift into false hope. The web also teaches hunger control. A healthy line can eat its vendors alive if appetite is left to impulse. So rules ration what can be pulled forward, and planners protect suppliers from being strip-mined by a single month's target. The lesson is older than any new building. Never let today surge salt, the ground that must feed you in spring. Auditors enforce this with dull, relentless logic. Their letters close loopholes, not throats. Behind them stand bankers who release cash for roofs and cranes in winter because they have been shown a schedule that breathes. Trust is a currency. It is minted in on-time pay and redeemed in honest reports. Watch finally how the web defends the constraint. Each week the bottleneck is named, and the river bends toward it. Bearings go there first. Skilled crews are scheduled there first. Maintenance walks there first. When the constraint shifts, the riverbed shifts. Everything else is scenery. This discipline looks like fussiness to outsiders and like mercy to those inside the clock. It is the difference between photographs of rows and rumours of what might have been. It is also the only fair way to spend a nation's patience. Feed the point that governs the month and protect it as if the war lived there, because for that week it does. Stand again on the catwalk. A crate arrives. A kit is built. A bay breathes. Somewhere a woman in a lighted room wipes a lens. Somewhere a man in a small town sets a dial. Somewhere a clerk stamps a paper that will move a train. None of these moments deserve a parade, yet together they make wings. The web is not metaphor in this story. It is a machine made of places, promises, pins, and people, and it hums because the country decided to love predictability more than drama. The roar you hear on the runway in the morning began as whispering work 1,000 miles away, and it keeps its promise today. Across the water, a different web strained against physics, fire, and the calendar. It had masters of craft and courage in abundance, and for years it produced machines that inspired fear. Yet the ledger that governs a war is not a single flight on a blue morning. It is a monthly sum that must survive bomb craters, fuel droughts, missing parts, and decisions that chase brilliance at the cost of rate. To see how the gap widened, you have to walk through the stack of constraints that thickened like winter clouds. Fuel thinned first where it hurts longest, in the training pipeline where hours become instinct. Engines that should have run hard under students sat silent, and pilots reached squadrons with fewer hours in their logbooks than doctrine allowed. That loss had a long shadow. Landings bent airframes that would have been saved by skill gained in an extra week. Maintenance grew harder because inexperienced hands strip threads and break fittings that veterans would nurse. Attrition crept from the schoolhouse into the line, and the ledger reflected it long after the cause had moved on. Transport began to fail in ways that made for dull maps and fatal days. Rail hubs were hit. Not once, but again and again, and the fragile genius of a complex schedule turned into guesswork. Parts that were interchangeable on paper balked in practice because jigs differed across dispersed plants. A rib drilled in one valley would refuse holes laid out in another. Managers did what they must under pressure. They authorized deviations to keep something moving. Every deviation solved a day and stole a month, because the next join would not join, and the next inspection would find a new argument. Skilled labor bled away into uniforms or rubble. Apprentices learned on smashed floors without mentors. Craft can survive in small islands under such stress, but craft cannot feed a continent of machines alone. Crews kept miracles alive in corners, coaxing engines from bent parts and matching skins by eye where gauges had been lost. Miracles save sorties, they do not scale. The ledger records them as the inability to hit a plan, then the inability to make a plan that anyone believes. Morale sinks when plans become theatre. New designs arrived, brilliant and seductive. Jets promised leaps that could vault over the brute math of mass. Rockets whispered of terror that would cost. Little to build and a lot to face. Leadership half believed and half prayed. Some of those machines flew and killed. They changed how defenders thought about speed and climb. The price was distraction at the moment. Discipline was most needed. Tooling was reworked, manuals rewritten, training split. Precious engines found themselves pulled from lines that had finally learned a rhythm and diverted to programs that consumed attention like firewood. Bombing did more than tear roofs. It moved meetings. It displaced jigs. It forced plants into basements and barns, safe from a single strike but slow to coordinate. Survival went up while throughput went down, and coordination took a tax that no accountant could hide. A manager who spent a morning assembling parts could not spend it aligning schedules across villages. Trains that once served one gate now stitched a patchwork of doors with different guards, habits, and clocks. Each added bit of safety added an equal measure of friction. Engines formed the hard ceiling. No airframe climbs without a heart, and hearts were scarce. Machine tools that could grind and polish to engine tolerances were jewels and targets. When one went down, the bottleneck's ripple ran 100 miles. Protecting such tools cost guards and resources that were then missing elsewhere. Leadership made triage decisions that robbed the month to save the week. Every time a lathe was moved in haste, precision bled from the shop and had to be repurchased with time that the calendar could not afford. Even when parts existed, standardization had been wounded by dispersion and expedience. Fittings that differed by a whisper jammed days. Paperwork tried to keep up, but paperwork written in terror is a bandage too late. Inspectors with the courage to halt nonsense were scarce, and when they used that courage they risked freezing entire cells that could not restart once power and people had fled to shelters. Motion was chosen over purity, and motion without purity writes its judgment in wrecked hours and grounded aircraft. Leadership faced choices that would test saints. Accept losses now by insisting on a smaller menu of types and variants, or bet that a miracle design would turn the tide if only it received attention. Pride, politics, and hope pulled toward novelty. Logistics pulled toward austerity. In war, hope is a comfort and a trap. The choice to keep many lines alive meant spare parts catalogues that grew like vines and training that fragmented across too many books. Swap ability fell. Field repairs turned into puzzles without solutions. By the last years of the fight, the contrast had hardened. One side spent its nights filling holes and moving people, holding the line with valor while the math ran away. The other spent nights tuning gauges and balancing stations, guarding sameness as if it were a sacred flame. No one lacked courage or intelligence. The difference lay in the health of systems that feed courage and direct intelligence toward rate. When fuel dries, when rails break, when engines starve, when a schedule becomes a rumor, even skill loses its grip. The lesson is harsh and useful. Brilliance must live inside a plan that survives bad months, or brilliance becomes a story told to comfort the tired today. Big numbers attract big stories. Some bring comfort, others accusation. Many are tidy in ways that the factory floor never was. Listen in hangars, in cafes, and on porches where memories cooled into myth, and you will hear explanations that try to shrink a lopsided ledger into a sentence. It is tempting to accept the neatest line. The truth is longer and calmer. It respects the work enough to keep complexity intact. One common story says superior machines settle every question, that the side with the most advanced design will walk to victory regardless of everything else. The record refuses that flattery. Great designs matter, but they must be fed by fuel, trained hands, spare parts, and schedules that arrive on time, or they remain bright drawings and short runs. Another favorite says a single company made the difference, that a nation's output can be reduced to one roof and a name. Cameras love big buildings and history loves a hero, but real output belongs to federations, boards that set priorities, bankers who pay for roofs and cranes, inspectors with gauges, schedulers with timetables, and hundreds of shops that learn to speak the same dialect. A plant can be a symbol and a school, yet it is fed by the web and judged by rules that live outside its fence. To talk about one roof as if it were the whole sky is to miss the weather that made the roof matter. A colder story claims money alone bought victory, as if a wealthy land could simply spend until the ledger tilted. Money does matter. It buys time, tools, and people. But money without governance rots. The papers in this tale show contracts paired with priorities, audits, and the right to say no when novelty threatens rate. Where waste appeared, it was studied and cut, and where profit appeared, it was earned by reliability, not games. Wealth provided the raw means. Method converted those means into months of flow. A cynical story insists the numbers lied and the photographs were staged, that the ledger was propaganda to comfort citizens and frighten foes. The comfort here is that it turns effort into theatre and lets cynicism wear wisdom. The annoyance is that it insults people who built, flew, repaired, and died. Records across plants, depots, and commands converge within dull margins. Not every count agrees. Wars are messy. But the shape holds across sources that share no need to flatter one another. When you study that shape, you find a rhythm that cannot be faked for long. A staircase climbed by thousands of ordinary steps. Another myth says bombing did nothing, that factories shrugged and kept pace. Yes, output often recovered after raids. The will to rebuild is a fierce engine. But recovery consumed slack and attention that could have raised ceilings instead of refilling rooms. Rail hubs do not shrug. Power stations do not shrug. Skilled workers do not shrug when homes burn. Even when roofs were patched quickly, dispersion slowed coordination and trained schedules to stutter. The result was not collapse on command, but a slow bleed that turned bold plans into specific disappointments. The opposite myth crowns bombing alone as the deciding force, reducing everything else to garnish. It is an attractive thesis because it makes a complicated win sound like a single lever. It ignores the durable work of running a national web that used law, finance, training, gauges, and timetables to convert potential into aircraft. Without that web, there would have been fewer targets to bomb. Raids mattered. They intersected with fuel shortages, transport failures, and late design churn. Effects meet causes in chains, not in slogans, and victory grows where chains are tended, not where lines are drawn on maps after the fact. A technical story claims precision craft and mass production are natural enemies, and that trying to fly the auto method was reckless. The floor tells another tale. Craft thrived inside fences, while jigs and gauges carried most of the weight of repeatability. Precision was not sacrificed. It was relocated from the wrist of a final fitter to the steel of fixtures and the language of drawings. When a wing made on Tuesday meets a fuselage made on Friday without prayer, you have not disrespected mastery. You have engineered it into metal so it can be shared. Some argue the 10-to-1 headline is a myth born of cherry-picked months and selective categories. Ratios are always summaries of a river, and the bend you choose will change the view. The useful act is not to cling to a single digit, but to trace the current across long stretches and across the kinds of machines that decide control of the air. Do that, and the pattern is plain. Periods exist in which one system sustained a flow the other could not match, while rails broke, fuel thinned, and dispersion added friction that courage could not cancel. The most dangerous myth is the one that flatters power. It says leadership alone is genius, and that systems are a footnote. Leadership does matter. Someone had to say no to distractions, yes to priorities, and pay on time. Yet leaders are judged by the habits they plant, the right to stop a line for truth, the duty to move tests upstream, the insistence on master gauges that end arguments, the weekly naming of the constraint. Without those habits, speeches are wind. With them, even average speeches become rails that carry trains. The reality that stayed is less dramatic and more useful than myth. It says sameness, backed by numbers and enforced by rules, can do sacred work without ceremony. It says a nation that learns to see its constraint and feed it with honesty will beat a nation that falls in love with single wonders. It says people who are trusted to learn, who receive tools that fit, and who are allowed to stop motion for truth, will build more than a manager who chases optics. The heroes in photographs knew this in their bones, even if they never said it. If you need an image to carry forward rather than a slogan, choose the quiet ones. Choose the inspector setting a master gauge on a bench while the shop hums. Choose the scheduler drawing a new path around a flooded spur and calling a yardmaster by name. Choose the teacher showing a novice how to seat a seal so a cabin stays warm at height. Choose the auditor who writes an unglamorous letter that closes a loophole and keeps a promise credible. None of these acts fit on a poster. All of them become airplanes. In the end, the most stubborn reality is this. Throughput is a moral choice made daily in small rooms. By many, at the end of a long walk, you owe the audience objects they can hold. Picture a wide table where calendars, charts, and a few sun-faded photographs are laid out like maps of a campaign. The first photograph is a building so large it looks like an argument with the horizon. The second is a row of wings gleaming under lamps. The third is a catwalk view down a straight line, with kits in order, carts aligned, and men and women at stations that look almost peaceful. Next to the photographs sit cards with dates and counts that feel too plain for glory and exactly right for truth. You can run your finger along a month when the curve bent and feel why a sneer could not survive. Another board holds the papers that bound the whole. A priority letter says in plain words that a crate of bearings will outrun a crate of anything else, and that the power to make that true exists and will be used. A contract shows the math that paid builders for progress that could be measured, but did not tempt them to invent change orders. An audit trail lists parts that cost what they should and calls out those that did not. And next to those lines are initials and dates that show reform rather than theatre. You can dislike bureaucracy and still love these pages. They are the spine that kept promises straight. The graphs are the least photogenic and the most convincing. One shows hours per aircraft falling in a curve the shape of patience. Another shows monthly totals stepping upward until they form a plateau, then climbing again as improvements land, and the next constraint becomes the point of care. A third overlays national output with rails drowned by bombs and fuel that never reached storage tanks across the sea. It is an unromantic braid of causes and effects that ends in a picture no speech can replace. Rows of machines under sun, in numbers that make the camera blink. You owe more than totals. You owe chains of cause. A fixture is redesigned to reference 3 firm datums instead of 2, and kills a drift that had forced end-of-line surgery on every airframe. That change saves an hour here and 2 hours there, and frees a crew that had become the unintended constraint. The crew moves to a bay that has long starved. That relief lets the line speed up by a small margin that compounds into an extra day of output by month's end. That day fills a ship. The ship carries aircraft that fly missions that turn maps. None of this is mystical. It is the dignity of cause and effect written in schedules and metal. On the other side of the table lie documents with soot on their edges and a smell like old rain. They testify to nights when plants were evacuated to barns and cellars. They speak of a committee that loved new designs and could not bear to reduce a menu of types, even when logistics begged for mercy. They show ration books that cut flight hours for students and pushed mistakes onto runways. They include brave letters from foremen who did everything a human can do in ruins and still could not meet a schedule written for a calmer world. These papers do not sneer. They grieve. They explain how courage without a system meets its limit. Lift your eyes from the paper and return to people. A young worker tapes a copy of a standard above a bay and points to the line that changed last week. Her team nods and the right hand moves to the right place. A supervisor listens to a novice explain a small stoppage and praises the stop before solving the cause. A maintenance crew measures pins on a jig and replaces them by calendar, not complaint. An inspector rejects a part with a clean signature, and the vendor fixes the fault without theatre. These are not stories for statues. They are receipts, and they are worth more than marble. Now widen the frame to the present tense. We build energy systems with chains of parts as long as continents, medical devices that cannot fail, networks that must not blink, and chips that demand choreography at the scale of atoms. The instinct to declare some field too special for standardization and upstream tests appears in each era with a new accent. The antidote has not changed. Move verification to the place where it is cheapest to learn. Build gauges that speak without argument and make drawings that force agreement. Balance work so ordinary hands can play the score at a steady tempo. Guard the constraint, not the ego. Publish the bad month so the good month can be believed. The lesson also asks for courage in finance and policy. Pay on time for progress that is real. Cap the kind of profit that invites games and leave room for the kind that rewards reliability. Publish enough truth to keep trust alive. Move scarce tools to the true constraint, even when it hurts friends. Say no to dazzling changes that promise headlines and steal months. Say yes to tiny fixes that save seconds and compound into aircraft. These requests sound like sermons until you put them next to the graphs and realize they are only descriptions of adulthood. There is room in this lesson for pride, but not the fragile kind. It is the pride of rows, not of singular sculptures. It is the pride of a team that sees its reflection in a steady chart. It is the pride of a town that feeds a plant and knows the plant feeds a nation. It is the pride of managers who will sign a delay today so that tomorrow's rate is real. It is the pride of auditors who are thanked rather than feared because their work makes legitimacy possible. It is the pride of hands that clock out into cold air and know the shift mattered. In the last photograph on the table, a pilot grins from a cockpit while crews in coveralls tighten a panel. The grin is not for the camera. It is for the certainty that there will be another aircraft behind this one, and another after that, because a web of people he will never meet has decided to love sameness and worship quiet numbers. Somewhere in a different picture that history filed away, a proud man who once laughed holds his hat and looks away while a runway fills. He is not the villain of this tale. He is its necessary skeptic, the one who makes the ending taste the way endings should when hard work wins. If there is a single sentence to carry out of the room, let it be blunt. Scale under pressure is built by ordinary people following good rules with good tools, inspected by other ordinary people who are allowed to tell the truth in time. That is the spine under every ratio in this story. Guard it, and the next emergency will find you ready. Lose it, and laughter returns today.